They said the king desired nothing more than loyalty, but the truth whispered through the palace walls told a different story. Servants vanished after midnight only to return, changed, quieter, hollow, as if something inside them had been taken and locked away where no torchlight could reach. And on one particular night, as the royal feast roared outside, a young attendant stepped into the king's private hall and saw something he was never meant to witness, something so strange, so unsettling, that even the shadows in the room seemed to recoil from it. He couldn't scream, he couldn't run, because the king was already watching him, smiling, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. There are kings remembered for their victories, kings remembered for their wisdom, kings remembered for the wars they won or the peace they created. But then there are kings. History tries desperately to erase, not because of violence carved into the battlefield, not because of armies drowned in ambition, but because their reign was shaped by a corruption far quieter and far more unsettling, a corruption of the mind, a corruption that twisted the very atmosphere of the palace around them. This is the story of a ruler whose name appears only in scattered fragments of forgotten manuscripts, a king whose kingdom feared him not for the sword he carried, but for the shadows he cast, a king who turned human lives into a private theater of obsession, a king historians now whisper about as the most perverted king in history. Yet his story is almost never told. But before we unveil this story, my mum said, "I will not reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong." Comment below where you are watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reach. Tonight you will hear it. Our story begins in a small mountain kingdom pressed between two powerful empires. The land was peaceful, carved with terraced farms, cool mist floating across ancient bridges, and people who lived quiet, simple lives. But at the center of the capital stood the structure that defined every breath of their existence. The Palace of Echoes, a vast residence so extravagant and so unnervingly still that travelers often claimed their voices felt different inside it, not in sound, but in feeling, as though the walls absorbed a piece of their thoughts. Within that strange labyrinth lived King Marcellin II, a young ruler who ascended the throne far earlier than anyone expected. He was quiet, pale, expressionless, and far too intelligent for his age. Many assumed he would seek validation through war or politics, but instead he withdrew from the public eye, sealing himself inside the palace for weeks, then months, then years, emerging only rarely, moving like a shadow in a place that belonged only to him. Marcellin hated being seen. Even as a child, he flinched when servants entered a room. He moved silently, avoided gatherings, and lowered his head whenever eyes turned toward him. But paradoxically, he loved watching others. He demanded it. He craved it. He spent hours standing behind the golden latticework windows of the palace, watching people cross the courtyard. He memorized their posture, their expressions, their habits. He memorized the way their hands moved when they spoke. He studied them as though they existed for his observation alone, as though they were actors in a play that only he could direct. But soon watching from windows was not enough for him. He needed more. He needed closeness. He needed access. He began by commissioning innocent renovations. A new corridor here, a restructured hall there, nothing suspicious at first glance. But hidden inside the architectural plans were strange instructions carved in symbols only the royal builders understood. Hidden chambers, hidden shafts, hidden spaces behind walls, narrow walkways between floors, places only he could enter. These were not military defenses or escape passages, they were listening rooms, narrow tunnels carved behind marble slabs that allowed someone inside to hear every word spoken in the rooms beyond. Some tunnels let him view entire conversations through carefully disguised lattice patterns carved into the decorative borders of the palace. No one questioned him. He paid the craftsmen too well. And slowly the Palace of Echoes became the only place on earth where the king always saw and always heard, while no one knew when he was watching. When Marcellin came of age, he made one final modification, the creation of the observation wing, a part of the palace restricted even from his highest advisors. This section contained galleries filled with items that appeared innocent, musical instruments, portraits, tapestries, robes, trinkets, but each held private meaning to the king alone. Each was connected to someone he had observed, someone he had studied, someone he wanted to keep, even if only in representation. Some historians called it a museum, others a shrine. But the truth was far stranger. The observation wing was where the king stored his attachments. To outsiders, Marcelline's reign seemed calm. Taxes were low. Trade routes remained open. There were no wars. But within the palace, everyone sensed something strange about the king's attention. He moved unpredictably, appearing in places he should not have been, knowing things he should not have known. Servants often froze when he addressed them because he always seemed to already know what they were thinking before they spoke. His presence felt heavy, like the pressure of a storm cloud. Officials tried to report concerns about his behavior, but these reports never reached the council. It was as though the palace itself swallowed them. But the king's true obsession began with a festival. It was the first time he left the palace in over a year, stepping into the night disguised beneath a hooded cloak. The streets were filled with music, lanterns, roasted foods, and laughter, the sound of a world he no longer belonged to. The king walked among the people unnoticed. His steps slow, his eyes scanning faces with intense hunger, as though searching for something only he could recognize. And then he stopped. Across the square, beneath a column of lanterns, stood a young woman performing a traditional mountain dance. Her movements were soft and fluid. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Something about her presence unsettled the king, not because it reminded him of anything, but because it awakened something inside him. Something that felt like curiosity, but sharper, colder, possessive. He stepped closer. The guards tensed behind him. The air shifted. And though she did not see him, her presence carved itself into his mind like a mark he could not erase. He returned to the palace in silence, but from that night on, the observation wing changed. He filled an entire gallery with artifacts representing her dance, fluttering fabrics, wooden instruments, fragments of lantern designs. He even ordered the royal tailor to recreate the exact robe she had worn, using only vague descriptions from his memory. The robe was placed on a mannequin, positioned beneath a lantern that burned every night, and then something unsettling happened. The king stopped observing others. He observed only her. Servants were dispatched to follow her discreetly. Her home was mapped, her routines were documented. Everything she touched was secretly purchased or copied. The king arranged his days around the moments he believed she was awake, or asleep, or practicing her dance. He was no longer watching a kingdom. He was watching a single person. And soon the observation wing filled with her likeness. But the king never approached her, never sent for her, never spoke to her. He didn't need to. In his mind, she already belonged to him. And yet, one day she vanished. Not kidnapped, not taken. She simply traveled to another village for a seasonal ceremony, unaware of the king's fixation. The moment he learned she was gone, something inside him snapped. The palace grew colder. The king stopped eating. He wandered the halls at night, pacing as though haunted. Servants reported hearing him whisper to empty rooms. He ordered a search for her. Not an arrest, not a retrieval, just a quiet confirmation of her location. When they returned with news that she was safe and would return in 2 months, he seemed relieved. But something darker had grown beneath that relief. For the first time, the king feared losing something, and fear, for him, was unacceptable. So he created a new form of attachment, one that he could control fully. He began selecting individuals, men, women, even children, who reminded him of people he had once observed, people who sparked curiosity in him. He handpicked them from villages with seemingly innocent invitations, scholarships, artistic opportunities, royal apprenticeships. They arrived in the palace with excitement, unaware the king had already studied their expressions months before. Once inside, they became part of his private world. He never harmed them. He never threatened them. But he arranged their lives like pieces on a board. Their clothes, their schedules, their tutors, their daily routines, all structured to reinforce the version of them he wanted to see. The palace staff noticed the pattern. These individuals never interacted with the public. They rarely left the observation wing. They were not prisoners, but they were not free either. They lived in a dream the king had created, a dream that reflected the attachments he could not control in the real world. But the king's darkest obsession was not with them. It was with the idea of preserving their existence exactly as he saw them, unchanged, untouched by time, perpetually performing their role in his imagined world. He instructed artists to paint their likenesses repeatedly, in different postures, different moods, different outfits. He commissioned sculptures, tapestries, wooden carvings, embroidered portraits. The observation wing grew into a labyrinth of faces, faces of people still alive, still breathing, yet frozen in representations that belonged solely to him. He became the curator of living ghosts. But as the years passed, the king's obsession reached a stage the palace had not expected. His collections became more elaborate, more consuming. The individuals he brought to the palace lived in curated rooms that reflected what he believed they should be. If someone smiled a certain way one morning, the king ordered a painting of that smile before sunset. If someone laughed softly during a music lesson, he instructed the musicians to recreate that exact tone of laughter in a composition. His world was no longer about observing life, it was about designing it. Soon, the observation wing contained entire recreated environments. A winter room with artificial snowfall, a lantern corridor mimicking the festival square where he saw the dancer for the first time, a flowing water hall built to echo the voice of one of his scholars. He spent nearly all his time wandering these rooms silently, touching walls, observing the slightest details, adjusting the arrangement of objects to match a memory only he knew. Servants called it the living museum. But behind closed doors they whispered a harsher truth. The king no longer saw people as people. He saw them as extensions of his obsession, pieces of a narrative known only to him. The dancer eventually returned to her village. She never knew the king had ever watched her. She lived peacefully, unaware that an entire section of the palace was dedicated to her image. But the king's obsession with her cooled over time, replaced by new fixations, new faces, new attachments. To him, she had served her purpose. She had awakened the part of him that believed beauty existed only when it could be possessed. And then came the day when the king's staff realized he had crossed an unspoken line. He ordered the construction of a room no advisor approved, a room with mirrored walls, no windows, dim lanterns, and a single elevated platform. He called it the reflection chamber. No one knew what it was for, only that the king spent hours inside it alone, studying his own image, whispering to it, correcting it, rehearsing emotions as though practicing how to be human. Some said this was the moment he lost the final thread of reality. Others believed this was when he began fearing himself. The kingdom outside the palace remained stable, but whispers of the king's strange habits spread slowly. A merchant claimed he saw silhouettes moving in the palace windows at impossible hours. A guard admitted he heard laughter echoing from empty rooms. Travelers reported seeing the king staring through lattice screens from high balconies, motionless for hours, as though he was waiting for a vision only he could see. Eventually, the council confronted him. They begged him to attend public ceremonies, to show himself to the kingdom, to prove he was still connected to reality. The king agreed, calmly, politely, even cheerfully, but what he did next would haunt the palace forever. On the day of the assembly, the palace doors opened, and the king stepped into view. But he was not alone. Behind him walked the individuals he had curated in the observation wing, dressed in pristine clothing, moving with rehearsed calm, their eyes empty, their expressions molded into the same soft, serene faces the king had fallen in love with. They stood behind him like living statues. The hall fell silent. Even the counselors trembled. In that moment it became clear that the king no longer understood the line between real and imagined. He did not see people. He saw creations, embodiments of his private fantasies, representations of what he wished they were, not who they truly were. He had curated life into a gallery of living dolls. The council did not remove him. They feared civil collapse. But from that day, no one entered the observation wing again except the king and the individuals trapped within its walls of silent admiration. By the time he grew older, the kingdom was functioning entirely without him. Advisors governed quietly. Citizens rarely saw him. And the palace, once the busiest place in the land, became a mausoleum of stillness. When the king died peacefully in his sleep, the palace staff discovered something chilling. The observation wing had been sealed. When they broke it open, they found rooms filled with paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and mannequins wearing perfectly preserved robes. They found chambers that recreated moments from the king's life, moments he had curated obsessively. And they found journals filled with detailed observations of every person he had ever fixated on. Not their actions, not their achievements, just their gestures, their expressions, their habits, their faces. The individuals he curated were gone. Some had fled. Others returned to their families. None spoke of their time in the palace. Not a single one. To this day, Ypsi's history barely acknowledges King Marcellin II, but those who study obscure chronicles describe him with one unsettling truth. He was the king who tried to preserve human beauty the way others preserved art. He was the king who turned people into reflections, the king who collected living memories and shaped them into silent devotion, the king who created a world where nothing could change except at his command. And that is why historians call him quietly, hesitantly, and with a touch of dread, the most perverted king in history.